I'm Pam from the Hooked on Sewing blog. Welcome to my YouTube channel. In this video tutorial, I'd like to teach you how to make a journal cover for a composition notebook. These journal covers are easy to make and they are a fun, practical gift. This journal cover has a fabric for the front, the back, and for the sleeves or the inside of the journal cover. Also used the same fabric for my loop. And then I used a fun contrasting fabric for the spine of the journal cover. This journal cover also has a piece of elastic sewn in it as a pen holder, and it has a button sewn onto the front so you can close the journal cover. Now this loop and button and elastic are all optional in the journal cover. In fact, I have made some, like this one, that doesn't have a loop or elastic on the journal cover. I still used contrasting fabric for the spine and a fun print for the front, the back, and the sleeves, and I just used a plain white cotton for my lining. And then another one that I did has this cork fabric. It has the button and loop closure, and it has cork fabric that I used for the spine. Now, I didn't do any quilting on the cork fabric, but I did quilt this fun print on the front and also on my sleeve pieces. And then I used just some plain fabric for my lining. And here's another example one that I did where I used some decorative stitching for my quilting on the spine. And then I just did some straight stitch quilting on the front fabric and the back fabric, spacing it about every 2.5 inches apart. But it's totally up to you how you do that. So let's take a look at the fabric and supplies that you will need to make a journal cover for a composition notebook. Of course, it's handy to have a composition notebook. I just purchased these up at my local store. You can also buy them online. And for the fabric, you will need fabric for the front, the back, and the sleeve of your journal cover. I use the same fabric for the front, the back, and the sleeves. You'll need some fabric. I'm using this really fun cork fabric for my spine. And I decided to use just a piece of contrasting fabric for my loop. And this will be the loop closure for my button. And you're going to need fabric for your lining. Again, like I said, I just used a piece of white cotton fabric for my lining. A 3-inch piece of elastic. This is some 3/8 inch braided elastic. You can also use round elastic or bigger or smaller elastic, whatever you have on hand or whatever you prefer. You're going to need some fusible fleece for your journal cover as well. You need a piece for the main part of the journal cover and 2 smaller pieces for the sleeve. Now, as far as supplies go, you will need a way, of course, to cut your fabric. I prefer to use a rotary cutter and my acrylic ruler with my self-healing mat. I highly recommend that you have these. You can also use just fabric scissors if that's all that you have. And it's really handy to have a small pair of scissors that you keep at your sewing machine to trim up any loose threads and just to have them handy. You may also want to have a fabric marking pen. This is by Friction, and I'll leave you a link to these as well. I like to use a walking foot when I'm doing some quilting, and this is the walking foot that I use. You'll want some matching or contrasting thread and your bobbin wound as well. And when I'm doing quilting, I like to use these Quilting Guide Bars. They help you to do some even stitching without having to mark up your fabric. You literally just take your ruler and your fabric marker pen and you make your first mark. And then you use these guide bars to help you evenly space your stitching. Now I have a video tutorial that tells you all about these guide bars and how to use them, and I will leave a link to that as well. In addition to that, you'll want some pins, and I love to use these Wonder Clips to kind of hold everything together. And of course, you will need your sewing machine. And it will be helpful to have your iron and an ironing board or ironing pad handy so you can iron your fabric. Let's take a look at how to make a journal cover for a composition notebook. Okay, so once you have all your fabrics and your fusible fleece, your elastic, everything cut out, we're ready to sew. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to stitch the fabric front to the spine fabric. So I'm just going to line up my raw edges and clip those in place using my Wonder Clips. You can use pins if that's what you have. I'm going to use 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I will back stitch at the beginning and the ending of my stitches to secure those threads. And here I'm just double checking to make sure I have a 1/4 inch seam allowance going. And I'm using my AccuFeed foot for my Janome sewing machine, which is a type of quilting foot. It's just really great for sewing multiple layers of fabric or different types of fabric. And again, use a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'll just remove my clips as I go. And when I get to the end of this row of stitching, I'm going to back stitch again to secure my threads. Okay, and now I'm ready to stitch the back piece of fabric to the spine piece. This will be the back, the exterior back of the journal cover. So line up those raw edges, the long edges. Make sure if you're using directional print that you have the print going the correct direction. And then just pin or clip those edges together. Again, I talk a lot about these Wonder Clips. They are a tool that I use in sewing a lot. I absolutely love them. I prefer them over pins in most cases. So I'm going to stitch this seam as well. Like I said, use a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'll back stitch at the beginning, remove my clips as I go, and when I get to the end of this row of stitching, I'm going to back stitch again to secure those threads. Okay, and now that I'm done stitching that, we're going to take it over to the sewing, or over to my ironing board, so I can press this down before we go on. So just be careful. I'm working with cork here, but whatever if you're using cotton fabric, it's not an issue, but I'm not real familiar with working with cork fabric. I've used it in a few projects, but I don't normally iron it. So just be careful and aware of that if you're using the cork fabric. But I'm going to press the seams in this case so that my seams go towards the cotton fabric or away from the binding, just because it lays smoother that way with this thick cork fabric. If you're sewing journal cover, then you have cotton in the middle. You can certainly press those seams open if you like, which is probably what I would do. And now I'm ready to apply my fusible fleece. Now be sure to follow the manufacturer's instructions for the particular type of fusible fleece or interfacing that you're using for your journal covers. Here I'm using Fusible Fleece. It's from Pellon 987F, which stands for Fusible. And it has a bumpy side, a textured side, and a smooth side. And that bumpy textured side goes next to your fabric. And you'll notice I'm not ironing, but I am pressing. So I'm applying heat to the fabric and the fusible fleece that is underneath to fuse that fleece to the fabric. Now here's a little tip. You'll see a water bottle sitting on my ironing board. To help with that, I don't keep water in my iron because they're prone to leaking when you do that. So I like to keep a spray bottle of water handy. And if you take and spray your fabric with that spray bottle of water and then press it, it seems to press quicker and has a stronger hold than if I just use heat. But again, follow your manufacturer's instructions for the type of fleece that you're using or whatever fusible product that you're using. If you're not using a fusible product, you can skip this step and we will sew it together in the next step. So while I'm at my ironing board, you see, I told you I was a little worried about the cork, and I do want to fuse the fleece to this cork just kind of as an experiment. On a previous journal cover that I made, I did not apply the fleece to the cork portion. I cut two smaller pieces, 5-inch pieces of fusible fleece, and I only fused them to the cotton fabric. So I'm kind of testing with this to see how it goes. So I'm using this pillowcase as a pressing cloth on top of the cork just to kind of protect that cork from the heat of the iron. It wasn't getting a really good adhesion, but that just may have been, you know, user error. Like I said, I was afraid of scorching or melting or having some kind of adverse effect on this cork because I'm not real familiar with it, but I carried on anyway. So these are the two front or interior, what I call sleeves, for your journal cover. And we are going to apply fusible fleece to those two. Now remember, there's a rough bumpy side and a smoother side, and that rough bumpy side goes next to your fabric. And you'll also notice that we cut the fusible fleece slightly smaller than the fabric. Now the reason we do this is to reduce the bulk of our seams when we go to stitch the pieces together. So here I'm laying the fusible fleece down, the bumpy side is up and against the wrong side of my fabric, and I am pressing the fabric, which is activating the adhesive on the fusible fleece and fusing it to the back of my fabric. So I will repeat that with the other sleeve. And it does take some time sometimes for these to fuse really well. But just take your time. You don't want to scorch your fabric, of course, so you want to kind of keep your iron moving so you can hold it in place for maybe 5 to 10 seconds, move it, change the direction of your iron, and just repeat that until you see that you have a really good adhesion. But like I say, always refer to the manufacturer's instructions. Okay, now I'm going to, while I'm at my ironing board, go ahead and press the loop that we're going to make for our button. So I'm going to take that piece of fabric, fold it in half, and press it with my iron. I'm going to unfold it, and I'm going to take the long raw edges and fold them towards that crease that we just made. And then, sometimes that fabric gets a little tricky to open back up, but okay. So I'm going to press the raw edge towards the fold, not all the way at the fold, but just coming up to it where it almost touches that crease line. And then just use my iron to create a nice crease along the one long edge. Then I'll turn the fabric around and do the same thing with the other long edge. Again, just press that down. And then I will fold it back along that original crease line that we made, and I'm going to press that again. This is my clapper. I use it a lot in quilting, but anytime that you're using heat to press seams open, or in this case to press our loop flat, it helps it to do a better job. Okay, now I'm going to take those pieces back over to my sewing machine, and we're going to start by stitching the long edge of the loop. There I have the fabric folded. I'm going to start with that folded end, and I'm going to stitch close, maybe 1/8 of an inch seam along that long edge to close that those fabrics. And I don't have to worry about back stitching at this point because those raw ends are going to be sewn into the book cover, and we don't have to worry about those ends coming loose. So sew along that long edge and then flip it around and sew along the other long edge. And I think I'm using a 3.0 millimeter stitch length for this. I like to use a longer stitch length when I'm doing top stitching, which is what this is. So I'm just gonna stitch straight along that other long edge. Okay, and then we have our loop piece ready. Okay, next we are going to do some top stitching along that spine. Remember, with the cork fabric, I press the fabric towards the exterior pieces of cotton fabric. So I'm going to stitch about 1/8 of an inch away from that seam, and maybe a 3.0, 3.5 millimeter stitch length along the front, just to kind of, for one, it gives it a nice finished look, and to just hold that seam down in place. Okay, I'll just stitch all the way down to the end, and since this is a top stitch, I don't need to back stitch, and then I will repeat this along the other edge of the cotton fabric that is sewn to the spine. Okay, now I'm ready to prepare this piece to do a little bit of quilting. I'm going to draw a diagonal line, and you could certainly do a straight line. You could skip this step altogether, but I think it gives it a nice touch to have this quilting to the journal cover. So I'm going to take my friction marking pen and draw a diagonal line on the front cover, and then I'm going to do the same thing on the back portion of it. I am not going to quilt the cork fabric. If you're using cotton fabric for the spine of the fabric, I usually quilt that different than I do the front two pieces, the front and the back piece, but that's, again, totally up to you. So I'm only drawing one line on each of these because I'm going to use my seam gauge to help me, my quilting guide bar actually, to help me stitch evenly spaced rows of stitching, and you'll see what I mean. If you don't have a guide bar, you can certainly go ahead and draw the lines that you want to stitch on. You could totally just do some free motion or whatever you like. You could just do some vertical lines that are 2 inches apart if that's what you want. I just like the look of doing some quilting, so I'm going to do it on a diagonal on the front and the back. I'm going to do kind of a hatch, so when I'm done stitching, it's going to look like a diamond design on the front and the back. But on the sleeves, I'm just going to do a diagonal rows of stitching. So you'll see. Let's take a look. I have my fabric marked on the front where I want to stitch. So I'm going to use a nice long 3.5, even 4 millimeter stitch length. And I'm just going to follow right along that line that I marked, all the way down from one corner down to the other. Again, because I'm top stitching or quilting, I don't need to, at this point, do any back stitching. My machine has an auto lock feature where it can lock the stitches, so I am going to do that sometimes when I'm stitching from the outside of the fabric towards the spine, just to keep those threads secure. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and use my gauge bars here. My guide bars, and this is a right guide bar. It will allow me to space my stitching however wide that I want. I think these are 3 inches, so I'm going to do 1.5 inches. So I'll just measure from the position of the needle to where the bar is and make sure that's lined up at my 1.5 inches. Again, you can use any stitch width, row width that you want. So what I'll do is I will line up my guide bar with the previous row of stitching. Then I'll lower my needle and I will so that guide bar goes straight down the previous row of stitches, and that's what I will use to guide me in my stitching to make sure I stitch these stitches nice and even. And here you can see I had a little problem with my sewing machine, and I have learned since then that I need to secure that top thread before I begin stitching, because it was causing a problem with getting caught up in the bobbin and just created kind of a mess. But I'll cover that in another topic. Okay, I have my stitching snafu taken care of, so let's go ahead and get back to this. Again, I'm just doing my quilting, following along the previous row of stitching to stitch a nice evenly spaced row of stitches on the front of the journal cover. Now, because I'm beginning these stitches close to the spine, I am locking my stitches in place first. If your sewing machine doesn't have this auto locking feature, you can simply keep a nice 3 to 5 inch long beginning thread, hold on to that, stitch your row, and then at the end of it you pull the thread on the front to the back, and then you just tie the front and the bobbin, the top thread and the bobbin thread together in a knot on the back of the fabric, and that will secure your threads. Okay, I'm just going to continue stitching, like I said, for the front and the back of the exterior fabric. For this particular journal cover, I am doing this cross-hatch top stitching or quilting on the front. So I'm securing my stitches at the beginning and the end by doing a lock stitch. If you don't have the ability to do a lock stitch with your machine, you can secure your threads by keeping a nice long tail, maybe 3 to 5 inches at the beginning of your row of stitching. And when you get to the end, you'll do the same. Cut off your thread so you have a tail of 3 to 5 inches, and then pull the top thread to the bottom of the fabric, and then you will simply tie a knot in the top thread and bobbin thread. You'll tie those together in a knot, and that will secure your threads. Okay, now I'm going to do that same top stitching or quilting on the exterior fabric for the back of the journal cover. I already stitched my first row, and I'm using my guide bar to keep my rows of stitches even. Then I'll move the fabric over and do the same thing for the next row. And I will just repeat that until I have those pieces of fabric quilted just the way that I want them. Okay, so now I'm going to quilt those sleeve pieces, and I will do the same thing with those that I did with the exterior fabric. I've already drawn my line, so I'm just stitching straight down that line. And then I will use my seam gauge guide bar to evenly space those stitches. Okay, once I'm through quilting those sleeve pieces, I'm going to hem the long edge that will be on the inside of the cover. So I'll just fold under 1/4 of an inch, press, fold under another 1/4 of an inch and press, and then I'll just stitch really close to that folded edge. And this will be the pieces that are not sewn into the journal cover, but will be the raw edge of the sleeve. So I almost forgot to do that, so you can ignore the other pieces that you see in this part of the video. I should have gone ahead and hemmed those 2 long edges before I stitched them together. So you can learn from my mistake here. I guess I just got in a hurry or just got ahead of myself. But anyways, you're just going to press the long edge about 1/4 of an inch and then fold it again 1/4 of an inch, press it, and then use your pins or clips to hold that in place, and then just stitch right along the edge close to that folded edge to finish that off nicely. Okay, so now we'll get back to sewing this all together. We're going to take our external fabric here. I'm just trimming some threads off first, making sure it's all evened up. And if you need to, go ahead and take your ruler and your scissors or your rotary cutter and trim up those edges so it's all nice and even. And here I am finding the back piece of the journal cover. I'm finding the center of that, by folding it in half. You can also lay it out and measure it. It should be about 5.5 inches to the center of that piece of fabric. So measure over 5 inches, 5.5 inches, find that point, and either mark it with a pen, a pen or a wonder clip, whatever you have that you like to use to mark your fabric. So measure over 5.5 inches and just mark that spot. I'm just going to insert a pin right there in the middle where the 5.5 inches are. Yep, it's right there at 5.5. So I'll take the loop that I'm going to use for my button closure. And here again, I'm just making sure I'm measuring it with my little ruler to make sure it's about 5.5 inches from one end. And then for the piece of elastic, I'm going to measure down from the top 2.5 inches, and that's where I'm going to stitch my elastic. So I'm going to go ahead and mark that spot too. Again, 2.5 inches down for the elastic and 5.5 inches down for the loop. So I've got those spots marked using my straight pins. I will take the piece of elastic and just fold it in half and then put the raw edges, because you really don't need such a long piece of elastic. I'm going to extend it past the raw edge of the fabric and then just clip it in place or pin it in place, whatever works for you. So the loop should be going towards the spine and the raw edges toward the raw edges of your fabric, and then pin or clip in place. Okay, so I'll take my loop and fold it kind of in half to make a loop. Make sure it is laying flat, and then line up my raw edges, and I will line up the raw edges with the fabric or extend them a little past that, and line it up with that pin or wherever you have marked the center of that edge of your fabric. So again, I'm just kind of lining up the raw edges and pinning the ends of the loop with the ends of the fabric for the exterior cover back. And then once I have those all pinned in place, I'm going to take it to my sewing machine and just baste them in place using 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch seam to kind of help hold those in place, so that when we go to sew the sleeves and the lining to the fabric, it's not moving around and we can hold it in place better. So I'm just basting the loop and the elastic in place, and I'm removing the needles or the pins before I get to them. So I'll start sewing, and once I get close to that pin, I can go ahead and remove it so that I don't end up breaking my sewing machine needle when I run over that pin. So getting the elastic piece ready, and again, when I get close to that pin, I'll stop and pull the pin out and then continue on sewing. So next, I'm going to take my scissors and I'm just going to trim those tab end pieces so that they're even with the fabric, and I'll do the same thing with the piece of elastic that I sewed into place, and I'll just make sure those edges are nice and even with my fabric. Okay, so now let's stitch these together. We're going to pin them all together first. I'm going to use my Wonder Clips. I'm going to line up the raw edge of the sleeve with the front edge of the journal cover. Make sure if you're using directional print that you have everything going the correct way. And the end, long end that I'm not pinning should already be pressed and stitched with a 1/4 inch seam that we pressed, folded and folded again, and stitched down that long edge to finish it. They're not finished here, like I mentioned earlier. I should have done it and I didn't, so learn from my mistake. So we're going to pin or clip the sleeve to the exterior fabric pieces. And then we will stitch a 1/4 of an inch along the long edge to stitch the sleeve to the journal cover exterior fabric. Okay, so then you'll repeat that for the sleeve and line up the long edge with the exterior fabric for the back of the cover. And once you've stitched that, we're going to layer that fabric with our lining. So you'll have the exterior fabric right side up. The sleeves that we just sewed on will already be right side down, and then we're going to lay the lining right side down on top of all of that, and then you can pin or clip it in place. And when we go to stitch it, we're going to leave a 3-inch opening at the bottom. Okay, so we're going to stitch all the way around using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and we'll leave a 3-inch opening at the bottom so we can turn that journal cover inside out. So again, I have my exterior fabric, my sleeves, and my lining all lined up, pinned together, and we are stitching around the perimeter using a 1/4 inch seam allowance and leaving a 3-inch opening in the bottom so we can turn the cover inside out. So once I get back to the bottom of that fabric, I'm going to back stitch to secure the threads, and then I'm going to trim or clip those corners, which will make for smoother corners when we turn this inside out. We don't have so much bulk in the corners. So I'm just going to clip them, each one of the corners, and then I'm going to go in again and clip those corners at an angle. And you can see I'm doing that here. So once I have all those clipped, we are ready to turn our journal cover inside out. So you really do need to leave at least a 3-inch opening in the bottom, especially when you're working with fabrics like cork or leather, because they're not as flexible, to give you plenty of room for turning that fabric inside out. Once I have the fabric all turned inside out, I'm going to use my bone folder, corner turner, something to poke out those corners. And then I will turn the sleeves so that they're right side out, lay this on my ironing board, and we're going to press all those seams nice and flat. You can see here I have my opening in the bottom. I still have that left to stitch, but I wanted to go ahead and give this a nice pressing. Making sure my seams are nice and flat, and just stitch all the way around the perimeter of the journal cover. And then you also want to press the lining because it's going to get pretty wrinkled just from all that turning inside out that we just did. So once you have that all pressed, then we'll be ready to hand stitch that opening closed. And I'm going to go ahead and press that opening, make sure it's turned inside a 1/4 inch and give that a little press. And then we'll be ready to hand stitch. Okay, so I've got my needle threaded and knotted, and I'm going to do a ladder stitch to close up this opening. I'm going to insert my needle so it's a little bit away from the opening, and then that will put the tail, the knotted tail end of my thread on the inside of the notebook cover. And you can pin or clip these edges together if that helps you. And I hope you can see this. It's kind of hard to zoom in and still have it focused really well. But I'm going to do a ladder stitch to secure this opening. It's a hidden way to sew this opening closed. So what I'll do is I'll insert my needle into either the fabric or the cork. I will insert it and then come back out probably an 1/8 of an inch away at the most in the same piece of fabric. So here we go. I'm going to take my thread, which I just pulled up through the cotton fabric or the lining. Now I'm going to go over to the cork fabric, and I'm going to make a really small stitch going in the cork and out the cork. There we go. So in through the cork, out through the cork, pull the thread up kind of taut, and then I will insert directly across from that stitch where I came up out of the cork. I will stitch directly across into the cotton fabric and make another small stitch in the cotton fabric, which means I'll go into the cotton fabric and I'll come out the cotton fabric probably 1/8 of an inch away. And then once I bring that needle and thread up through the cotton fabric, I will stitch, put my needle down into the spine or the cork fabric directly across from where my needle just came out, and I will poke my needle through that cork and pull it up about 1/8 of an inch away, and just continue doing that, stitching back and forth on the 2 pieces of fabric until I have it completely stitched. Okay, then when I get to the end, what I like to do is to knot off my thread and then stick the needle into the fabric and come out at someplace else in the fabric and pull that thread through, and then I will just snip off my thread. So I take this back over to the ironing board and press that bottom seam where I just hand stitched it nice and flat, and give a once over pressing to the whole journal cover. And now we are ready to sew our button onto the front of the journal cover. So first we need to determine exactly where we need our button to be. We know we need it to be centered on the long edge, so 5.5 inches, 5.25 inches down the sides of the fabric, and lined up with the loop. And so you'll measure over, mark a spot, maybe 1 inch, 1.5 inches from the folded edge of the journal cover. And that is where we are going to sew our button. So once again, grab your needle and thread, and this time I double knotted or double strand my thread and then knotted it. I'm going to insert my needle where I have my mark on the exterior fabric and come back out just right adjacent to that. So my knot will be on the exterior fabric, but it will be hidden by the button. So pull that through, and then with the eye or the loop on the button itself, I will insert my needle through that loop. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and make another stitch just to secure that beginning thread. Okay, now I'm going to insert the needle through that little loop, that circle on the bottom of my button. And I'm going to stitch it onto this fabric so that my button is laying correctly. And then I will insert it through the loop, pull that through, and then I will insert it through the fabric, come back up on the other side of the loop in the fabric and pull that thread through. And I will do that probably 8 or 10 times. And then once I've done that, I'll take and wrap my thread around the thread that I just stitched around the base of the button 3 or 4 times. And then I will knot it off and insert my needle into the fabric close to that button that I just sewed on, and bring it out somewhere else in the fabric, and then cut off the thread from there. That way the end of my thread is somewhere inside the fabric and not on the outside of the fabric where it can be seen or where it can easily unravel. Okay, we're now ready to insert the journal inside the journal cover. Just take the front cover of the notebook and insert it into the sleeve. Kind of fold the notebook back and insert the back cover into the back sleeve of the journal cover. Then flip it back over, smooth it all out, fold it up. You can then button the journal cover closed. And then to insert a pin into the pin holder you just made, I like to insert it through the elastic and then have the bottom part of the pin to be enclosed in a loop. That secures it, holds it to the notebook, and keeps the end from being loose. And there you go. You have your completed journal cover for a composition notebook. I hope you have enjoyed this video tutorial. If so, be sure to like it, subscribe to my YouTube channel, and please come visit me over on the Hooked on Sewing blog. Thank you for watching this video.